Got a signal.
We moved the desk. I have to move the camera.
Oh.
Well, you're on. You're on now.
It's your face.
I'll move the camera.
Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarva dharma swarupini avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our ongoing class on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. In today's class, we'll be discussing Sutras 1.6 through 8. So 3 sutras, 6, 7, and 8 of Book 1. A heads up on the next 2 classes. Thursday, June 6th is our next class. And we'll be discussing Sutras 1.9 to 1.11, 9, 10, and 11. And so the homework assignment is to read Edwin Bryant's commentary on 1.9 to 1.11 on pages 39 to 47 of his book, the Yoga Sutras of Patañjali, which is our main textbook for this class. And the class after that is going to be held on Tuesday, June 18th. Tuesday, no, not Thursday. Usually it's Thursdays, but there's also Tuesday class, June 18th. And I'll give you the homework assignment later on June 6th. Okay, so that's in terms of heads up. I also wanted to, before we plunge into Sutra 6 of Book 1 of Yoga Sutra, I wanted to make a little note on methodology, our overall approach to this wonderful text, the Yoga Sutra. One thing, for those of you who have been following this class, you'll know that one of the major philosophical questions, puzzles that keeps coming up is, who exactly is bound and liberated according to Sankhya and yoga philosophy? Who exactly is it? And I've talked about it a lot, and I think people might be even starting to get tired of my bringing it up all the time. So I wanted to explain, first of all, why I'm bringing it up so often, and how it's relevant to us as spiritual aspirants. So, first of all, it's a very important question, because all of spiritual life sort of depends on it, you know. I mean, I feel like I'm bound. I feel like I'm suffering. I'm the one who's seeking liberation. Who is the I? And if a philosophy is not able to give a coherent answer to that question, maybe we should look for a different philosophy. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think it's important. But another reason is that it's not like only critics are bringing up the question. Traditional commentators themselves, who belong to the yoga tradition, raise the question again and again. We'll see that in Vachaspati Mishra's commentary on, I think it's either Sutra 6 or Sutra 7. Okay. And just taking a step back, whenever we approach a spiritual text, a scripture, whether it's the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Yoga Sutras, any other text, the Nyaya Sutras, I think it's important to try to take the text on its own terms. Let the text speak for itself. Which means what? We should avoid this tendency, which is very common actually, I would say, especially among those who are primarily oriented towards spiritual practice. What they tend to do is they'll read their own views into the text. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but I think that there's a better approach, which is as follows, taking the advice of Sri Ramakrishna. And again, his teachings are always better in Bengali, so I have to give you the Bangla first, and then I'll explain it. So he would say, Gol malache, gol te baad diye mal te nebe. And it's impossible to translate because he's punning on a word in Bangla, golmal, which means, the whole word means trouble. And the word gol in the word golmal, G-O-L-M-A-L, means trouble as well. And mal means the essence, the thing that's really important and good. So Sri Ramakrishna says, golmal, there's trouble. What should you do? You should separate the negative from the positive and take only the positive. So I suggest that we adopt this kind of Ramakrishna methodology when it comes to scriptures. When we're confronted with a text, let's first try to understand what exactly the text is saying. And remember, the Yoga Sutra is not just a practical manual of spiritual practice. That is an important part of what it is. It's one of the main emphases in the text, but it's not all spiritual practice. There's also a lot of philosophy. It makes a lot of philosophical claims. And the two things are inseparable. The philosophy and the spiritual practice are inseparable from each other. And it's important to take that into account. So now, as many of us are Vedantins, or we belong to some other spiritual tradition, right? Not necessarily the yoga tradition. So as Vedantins, how do we approach this text? One approach is to just read Vedanta into the text. It's a Vedantic text. Patanjali is saying the same thing as Shankara. Shankara says the same thing as Ramanuja. I have a term for this, which is starting to catch on. I call it lazy harmonizing. Sorry, is the mic too far away? Maybe I should bring it closer. Okay, sorry. The online people might be complaining. Okay. Check online whether people are complaining about the... Oh, okay. Oh, they're fine. Okay, so... lazy harmonizing. This is, I would call it a vice in reading texts, where because I'm a Vedantin, therefore every text I read, I'll just put on my Vedanta glasses and read every text through that lens. And lo and behold, Yoga Sutras turns out to be Vedantic as well. Better than that, okay, there are two approaches. I think there are two extremes we should avoid when we interpret any text, including this text. One is the dry scholarly approach. Scholars are really good at trying to let the text speak for itself. What exactly is yoga philosophy? How does it differ from other schools, right? But it's very weak on spiritual practice. So pure scholars who have no interest in spiritual practice will get bogged down in technicalities, go into hair splitting, and at the end of the day, spiritual aspirants kind of feel left high and dry. But there's something to learn from that approach. What should we take away from the dry scholarly approach is what's really good in their emphasis is trying to understand what the text itself is trying to say, trying to take the text on its own terms. Okay? But we need to supplement it with an emphasis on spiritual practice because all of us are spiritual aspirants. That's why we're here. And at the other extreme is what I call lazy harmonizing. And it's Vedantizing this text. Just because I like Vedanta, therefore I'm going to read this text as a Vedantic text. That means we're not letting the text speak for itself. We're not doing the text justice. But what's good about it is the emphasis on spiritual practice. Because at the end of the day, we're reading all these scriptures to make spiritual progress and ultimately to realize the self, realize the divine, right? Attain liberation. So let's try to combine the best of both approaches while avoiding the weaknesses. Let's try not to be lazy harmonizers on the one hand, but at the same time, keep our eyes focused on spiritual practice. And we can learn from the scholarly approach, which is let the text speak for itself, while at the same time not getting too bogged down in technicalities. So that's my hope. And that's the rationale behind raising this question again and again. But also, ultimately, what you'll find is, and this is true of any text, almost nobody will accept 100% of a text, right? So a good reader will separate what they like about a text from what they don't like, what they accept in a text from what they don't accept. So the first step is actually being able to distinguish what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And then you take the good and you reject the bad. Vivekananda himself does it. Swami Vivekananda has several lectures on Sankhya and Vedanta where he points out, he says, Sankhya is wonderful. I fully accept it except for these doctrines. The metaphysical dualism between Purusha and Prakriti. Sankhya also doesn't accept a personal God, but as Vedanta, it's good to accept a personal God, and so on and so forth. So I think we should do something similar. That's what I'm suggesting. Okay? So, now let's plunge into Sutra 6, but we've been doing this thing where we recite the sutras in Sanskrit first at the beginning of class. So let's start. So 1.1 through 1.8. And I've been encouraging people to try to memorize the sutras. I don't know if there are any takers yet, but you can just repeat after me. I'm going to say one sutra at a time and repeat after me, even just following the book, whatever book you have. Atha yoganushāsanam yoga citta vritti nirodha tada drashtuhu swarupe vasthanam. Good. Vṛttisārūpyam itaratra vrittayaha panchatayyaha klishta klishtaha Klishta, actually, see, because of sandhi, it's a Sanskrit rule. It sounds like this, klishta, klishta, but actually the words are klishta, aklishta. And the a gets dropped because of sandhi. So let's just repeat the last phrase. Klishta, aklishta. Good. Okay, I'm going to break this up. The next one, 1.6. Pramana, viparyaya, vikalpa, nidra, smritayaha. Good. 1.7. Again, I'm going to break this up. Pratyaksha, anumana, agamaha, pramanani. 1.8. Viparyayo, mithya jnanam, atadrupa, pratishtham. Good, very good. Yeah, okay, I'll break it up from now on. Sorry, I was getting carried away. Because when I memorize it as a whole thing and then, all right. Okay, so there's a lot to discuss here. Sutra 1.6. So 1.5, just to remind you, tells us that there are 5 kinds of Vṛttis, which Bryant translates Vṛttis as states of mind, yeah? Some others translate it as mental fluctuations, something like that. So there are 5 different kinds. Some are detrimental to the practice of yoga, others are non-detrimental. Klishta versus aklishta. In that context, the next sutra, 1.6, define what are the 5 main kinds of vritti. They are as follows. And pramana. And then 2, viparyaya. 3, vikalpa. 4, I can give this, nidra, and then smriti would be memory. Okay? I gave the Sanskrit of the first 3 because they're, it's important to know what the original terms are. Okay, so now, let's look at page 32 of Bryant's book, for those of you who have it, either soft copy or hard copy. Right off the bat, my great hobby horse comes up, that question again, who is bound and liberated? So let me just read to you his commentary, Bryant's commentary on 1.6. The vrittis, which bind Purusha to the world of samsara, are enumerated here. How does this first sentence relate to this question we've been asking? Who is bound and liberated? It says the vrittis which bind Purusha to the world. Now it's Purusha which is bound. That has not been Bryant's position all along. It was supposed to be mind which is bound, which falls on the side of Prakriti. According to Sankhya Yoga philosophy, there are only 2 fundamental entities. There's Purusha and Prakriti. And Purusha is never supposed to be bound, and Prakriti, but Purusha is conscious. It's a conscious soul, a conscious eternal soul. That's Purusha. And each one of us has a different Purusha. And then there's Prakriti, which is insentient nature. Even mind falls on the side of insentient nature. Chitta, buddhi, manas, all that falls on the side of nature. And generally, Bryant's line is that it's buddhi, which falls on the side of Prakriti, which is the thing that is bound and liberated. And the thing I keep pushing back on is, how can something that's insentient be the subject of bondage or liberation? And on the other hand, Sankhya and Yoga both insist that Purusha can never be bound or liberated, by definition, because Purusha is ever free. It never actually gets bound. And so what I'm finding so far Bryant doing is toggling back and forth between sometimes suggesting that it's Prakriti, some aspect of Prakriti which is bound and liberated, and sometimes suggesting that it's Purusha. So here, again, it's veering toward Purusha. The vrittis which bind Purusha to the world of samsara. And something that Narayana brought up last time, I think is right on, actually. He suggested maybe what Bryant's doing is reflecting the ambiguity or ambivalence of the traditional commentators themselves. And I think that's right, actually. If you look at the traditional commentators, they sometimes talk as if it's the Purusha that's bound and liberated. And sometimes suddenly they shift and say, oh, it's really the buddhi that's bound and liberated. And he seems to reflect that to some extent.
But this sentence doesn't actually, I mean, it's possible that the Purusha, when you say it's bound to, doesn't mean that Purusha is bound. It's just the way that it identifies with Prakriti.
Right.
I don't know if there's a difference there.
Well, yeah, no,
like
that's a good question. But the thing is,
it's not saying that Purusha is necessarily bound by itself, but how it identifies with.
Right, but the thing is, Purusha is not even supposed to make any mistaken identifications.
Oh.
it should not be making misidentifications at all. And that's the issue, because that itself is an error, which by definition Purusha should be free from. So it gets tricky. So anyway, but again, let's not get bogged down too much on that issue. I did want to point out a couple things here. The second term, viparyaya, Bryant translates as error. Oh, so pramana is translated as right knowledge, and Swami Vivekananda gives exactly the same translation, actually, right knowledge. Different translators will give subtly different translations of different terms, but here they fully agree. But with the second term, viparyaya, there's a slight difference. Bryant translates viparyaya as error, seeing something for what it is not, basically. We'll get to that. Whereas Vivekananda translates it as indiscrimination, but it amounts to the same thing, actually. They actually agree on what viparyaya means. The more interesting difference is in the third vritti, vikalpa. Bryant renders it as imagination, and Swami Vivekananda as verbal delusion, which is quite different. And we're going to get to it in the next class, because there's a separate sutta that's coming up that defines vikalpa. So we'll talk about it then. But I just wanted to flag right now that there is a discrepancy in Vivekananda's and Bryant's understanding of the third kind of vritti, vikalpa. Okay? And the last two, everybody basically agrees, sleep. But Hariharananda Āraṇya adds that it's dreamless sleep, deep dreamless sleep. Sushupti, as opposed to the kind of sleep in which we can perceive dreams. So that's nidra. And fifth, memory, everybody agrees again on what that is, smriti. Okay, so that's what I want to mention. We're going to spend most of our time on 1.7, basically the brunt of the class, the rest of the class. Sutra 7 focuses on the first of these 5 vrittis, pramana, and says there are 3 pramanas. Okay? What are the 3 pramanas? Pratyaksha is the first kind. Should I write this? Oh boy. Okay. I'll do it while sitting. It'll be. Okay. The 3 pramanas.
And pramanas again is right knowledge.
Yeah. Right knowledge. First. Pratyaksha. What does pratyaksha mean? It means direct perception. Yeah, direct perception. Sorry. My handwriting is already bad, but this just makes it worse. Okay. Pratyaksha, direct perception. Second, anumana, which means inference. Third, agama, which means verbal testimony. Okay, these are the 3 pramanas. Let's talk about the first one first, pratyaksha. Okay, I have to explain something else now too. That's why I wrote this. Pramana. Okay, the term pramana is a loaded term in an Indian philosophical context. There's a whole field of philosophy in Western philosophy called epistemology. Epistemology means the philosophical study of knowledge. It asks questions like, what is knowledge? How do we acquire knowledge? Those kinds of questions, okay? There is a robust tradition of Indian epistemology as well. There's a whole, and Nyaya especially specializes in, but every school, every philosophical school has epistemology. And yoga does too. And there are 2 terms used constantly in Indian epistemology. One is pramana, the other is prama. And typically, pramana in traditional Indian epistemology means means of knowledge, the means of knowing something. And prama, a different term, prama means right knowledge. So a pramana should generate prama. That's what traditional Indian epistemology holds, whether it's Nyaya or Vedanta. What's a concrete example? One of these pramanas is pratyaksha. One of the standard forms of pratyaksha is sense perception. I see a laptop. I perceive this laptop with my senses, right? My means of knowledge, my pramana, is the senses. Sense perception itself. Sense perception. And what is generated from my sense perception of this laptop? The right knowledge that there is a laptop in front of me. You see? Why am I bringing all this up? Because it's a little confusing to people who have some background in Indian epistemology. Because in the Yoga Sutra, pramana is being defined as right knowledge. The term pramana is used, except it's not being defined as means of knowledge, it's being defined as right knowledge, as the right knowledge that arises from the use of a pramana. So you have to keep that in mind, just so that you're not totally confused. Basically, what pramana means in yoga philosophy is equivalent to prama in traditional Indian epistemology. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's just a kind of caveat to keep in mind. Now, direct perception. Before we get to the different pramanas, let's look at page 33 of Bryant's commentary on 1.7. At the very bottom, he says, Vachaspati Mishra raises a question here. If the impression is imprinted on the mind, which according to the metaphysics of yoga is a totally separate entity from the Purusha soul, then how is it that the latter is aware of it? In other words, if an impression is something that is made on the mind, then how does it end up being made on the Purusha? See, the context is Vyasa, the original commentator on the Yoga Sutra. There's a sentence in his commentary on 1.7, which I'll read to you. He says, the Purusha mistakenly thinks that it is the chitta vṛttis in the mind. What you were saying about the mistaken identification. You're saying, why? That seems like that could be. It's not that Purusha is actually bound, but Purusha misidentifies with the chitta vṛttis, right? This is what Vyasa seems to be saying. The Sanskrit is paurusheyaha chitta vritti bodhaha. This is the sentence that Vachaspati Mishra is raising a question about. He's saying, wait a minute, because Vachaspati Mishra is a follower of yoga, and he's saying, wait a minute, the Purusha can't misidentify anything. He can't make that, it's not even he, it can't make that kind of mistake. And so that's the question, is that Vachaspati says, if the impression is printed on the mind, the vritti is in the mind, that's on the side of Prakriti. And that mind is a totally separate entity from the Purusha, which is on the other side, right? How is it that the Purusha is aware or makes the mistake of thinking that it's the chitta vṛttis, which are in the mind? They're not connected with each other in any way, according to Sankhya Yoga metaphysics. And then there's this long discussion. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I hope you did the homework, so you read it. But the gist is as follows, as far as I can tell. Vachaspati's answer is, what Vyasa actually means is that Purusha is not actually the one who's misidentifying. It's the consciousness of Purusha as reflected in our buddhi, in our mind, that is making this misidentification. That would be Vachaspati's claim. Again, the same question arises about how something insentient can make a mistake in that way. You will say, well, because of the reflected consciousness of the Purusha. But then it's really still the consciousness of the Purusha that we're talking about and not the consciousness of the buddhi. Anyway, so that's one thing I wanted to flag. Direct perception, any kind of sense perception, but another thing to keep in mind is that in Indian philosophy in general, most schools like Vedanta, Nyaya, Yoga, Sankhya, they accept two different kinds of direct perception. One is sense perception, the other is supersensuous perception, sometimes called Yogaja Pratyaksha, Yogaja, the perception born of the power of yoga. There's yogic perception. Like when Swami Vivekananda went all over Calcutta asking people, have you seen God? Have you seen God? And then finally Swami says, yes, I've seen God. And I see him and talk to him or her more directly than I'm talking to you right now. That's pratyaksha. But it's not sense perception in the sense that we're thinking of. He's not seeing God using the same senses that he uses to sense the laptop or the table, right? So that's yogaja pratyaksha. So there are two different kinds of pratyaksha. Swami Vivekananda has a wonderful commentary on this sutra. And most of it focuses on pratyaksha, unpacking the importance of pratyaksha, this first pramana. And I want to read to you part of it at least, because I think it's really important. Swami Vivekananda, this is from his book Raja Yoga. He says, there are three kinds of proof. Direct perception, pratyaksha. Whatever we see and feel is proof, if there has been nothing to delude the senses. I see the world. That is sufficient proof that it exists. Secondly, anumana, inference. You see a sign, and from the sign you come to the thing signified. It's the second pramana, anumana. The standard example used in Indian philosophy is, I see smoke. If I see smoke, I have pratyaksha of smoke, right? I have a direct sense perception of smoke. I can infer that there is fire there, because without fire there can never be smoke. And so even though I'm not directly perceiving the fire, I can still have knowledge of fire through this other means of knowledge called anumana, inference. You see the difference between pratyaksha and anumana? In the case of pratyaksha, I actually perceive the fire. Therefore, and then through that means of knowledge, then I attain the knowledge of fire. That's pratyaksha. Second is, I don't see any fire, but I see smoke. And I know that wherever there is smoke, there is fire. And so I infer, anumana, that there is fire, and therefore I gain knowledge of fire. So I have knowledge of fire without the sense perception of fire, through inference. Does that make sense? Okay, let's continue. Swamiji continues. Thirdly, aptavakya. That's another term for agama here. Aptavakya. The direct evidence of the yogis, of those who have seen the truth. This is really interesting. He's already presupposing this second kind of pratyaksha. There are two different kinds of pratyaksha, remember? One is sense perception, the other is supersensuous perception. Now he's thinking of the supersensuous perception of the yogis. What do I mean by that? The yogis' perception of supersensuous entities like God, the soul, and so on and so forth, other realms. Swamiji says, we are all of us struggling towards knowledge, etc. I'm going to skip parts of it. Then he mentions the authors of the sacred scriptures. He says, these are paradigmatic examples of aptavakyas. Falls under this agama, verbal testimony. The great mystics and saints of the world, like Jesus and Buddha and all these people, have left behind records, right, of their testimony. That's what he's talking about. And the religious scriptures are nothing but verbal testimony of realized souls. That's what Swamiji is saying. Then he says, therefore the scriptures are proof. If any such persons are living now, their words will be proof. Other philosophers go into long discussions about aptavakya, and they say, what is the proof of their words? Why should we believe them, right? They're just saying something. Anybody can say anything. The proof is their direct perception. Notice this sentence. The proof is their direct perception. See, these yogis have directly perceived something, and then they're reporting about their perceptions. And that's what we have in the form of the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Bible, and so on and so forth. This is Swami Vivekananda's interpretation of this sutra. And then Swamiji says, Because whatever I see is proof, and whatever you see is proof, if it does not contradict any past knowledge. There is knowledge beyond the senses, and whenever it does not contradict reason and past human experience, that knowledge is proof. Any madman may come into this room and say he sees angels around him. That would not be proof. In the first place, it must be true knowledge. And secondly, it must not contradict past knowledge. And thirdly, it must depend upon the character of the man who gives it out. I hear it said that the character of the man is not of so much importance as what he may say. We must first hear what he says. This may be true in other things. A man may be wicked and yet make an astronomical discovery. But in religion, it is different, because no impure man will ever have the power to reach the truths of religion. Therefore, we have first of all to see that the man who declares himself to be an apta, A-P-T-A, apta, is a perfectly unselfish and holy person. Secondly, that he has reached beyond the senses. And thirdly, that what he says does not contradict the past knowledge of humanity. Okay, so there's a lot here, and I wanted to dwell on some aspects of what Swamiji is saying. There are a few places where Swamiji asks directly, what is the proof of God? And his answer is direct perception, pratyaksha. Direct perception. I've written a whole book on Swami Vivekananda's philosophy, and two of the chapters, chapters 5 and 6, concern Swami Vivekananda's views on spiritual perception, spiritual pratyaksha, yogic perception. And I show how he develops a very sophisticated argument for God's existence and the existence of a soul on the basis of pratyaksha, perception. And it goes roughly as follows. And it's all basically based on this commentary, on this sutra. He presents some principles which he takes to be uncontroversial. One of them is what I would call the principle of perceptual proof. I see a wall. We all see a wall. Therefore, I am justified in believing that there's actually a wall there. It seems obvious to you. It should seem obvious. That's what Swamiji is hoping, that nobody's going to argue against that. Right? I see a pew. Therefore, I'm justified in thinking that a pew exists right in front of me. Right? We all do this all the time. We wouldn't be sitting here now unless we accepted this principle implicitly. First principle. Second principle is the principle of testimonial proof, is what I would call it. Okay. We rely on this principle all the time, but this may not be as obvious. What do we do when after breakfast or before breakfast with a cup of morning coffee? We read newspapers, or these days we browse newspapers online or whatever. We read about what's happening throughout the world. We don't run off and verify every claim that's made. No, but because we trust that other people have actually perceived these things and they're reporting accurately. Unless we have some reason to believe that they're deceiving us. That's why Swamiji is so insistent, the person needs to be reliable, trustworthy. So this third pramana, agama, is the verbal testimony of reliable people, of trustworthy people. And a huge amount of our knowledge comes from agama. Many of us have not visited Russia, for instance, but we believe that Russia exists. On what basis? History books and newspapers and photographs which suggest that there is this country called Russia, right? Photograph is more complicated. That's not verbal testimony. That's photographic testimony. But sorry, this is not the best example. But, history books about the Kremlin and about this country called Russia, right? So you get it. So now, if we accept these two principles, the principle of perceptual proof and the perceptual of testimonial proof, then some really interesting things happen. People all over the world claim that they have perceived God or some kind of ultimate reality. Advaita Vedantins call it the Atman, non-dual Atman. Yogis, followers of the yoga philosophy and Sankhya will say they've realized Purusha, their true nature is Purusha. Theistic mystics will say that they've realized Allah, Christ, Krishna, Kali, Shiva, Ganesha, so on and so forth, right? That all falls under verbal testimony. These are people who say, hey, I have perceived X, Y, or Z, some some supersensuous entity, God or the self. And Swamiji says, well, if we accept these principles in the case of ordinary sense perceptions, it stands to reason to accept them in the case of supersensuous perceptions as well. So when people, mystics, yogis, saints, claim to perceive certain things like God or the soul, it's equally reasonable for us to even to believe that God exists. We haven't perceived God, we haven't realized God yet, but it's reasonable for us to believe, to accept the verbal testimony of those who claim that they have perceived God. That's the idea, in a nutshell. And if you want details, it's almost 100 pages. Chapters 5 and 6 of this book go into the technical details, working out Swamiji's argument. Okay? But this is the core argument. It's contained in his commentary on Sutra 1.6 of the Yoga Sutra. 1.7, sorry, of the Yoga Sutra. Okay? All right, so that was something I really wanted to cover. And the other thing is, I wanted to mention, this is also discussed in this book as well, Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta Cosmopolitanism. Swamiji's views on scripture, I see them as actually pretty radical. And I wanted to share with you, see, according to traditional schools of philosophy, traditional Vedanta, for instance, okay, in India, they take the scriptures to be authorless. Apaurusheyatva, that's the name, that's the doctrine. Apaurusheyatva. There's no author of the scriptures. Swamiji, remember his language in his commentary on 1.7? He refers specifically to the authors of the sacred scriptures. So I see him as breaking with tradition here, even with traditional Vedanta. Traditional Vedantins say there's no author. The mantras just exist eternally of the Vedas, the mantras of the Vedas. And Swamiji says that doesn't stand to reason. There are realized souls who report their spiritual experiences, and that comes to us in the form of these scriptures. That's a more rational way of thinking about it. That's Swamiji's idea. Let me read to you a quotation of his from a different place, for a different text. He says, it's from volume 6 of the Complete Works. He says, the Vedas are anadi, eternal. The meaning of the statement is not, as is erroneously supposed by some, that the words of the Vedas are anadi. Anadi means beginningless or eternal. It's not that the words of the Vedas are eternal, that's the traditional view, but that the spiritual laws inculcated by the Vedas are such. These laws, which are immutable and eternal, have been discovered at various times by great men or rishis, though some of them are forgotten now, while others are preserved. So he's making this subtle distinction between the words of the Vedas versus the spiritual laws taught in the Vedas. The spiritual laws are eternal, but the words are not eternal. The words are written or verbally recited, most likely. At that time it was an oral tradition. Orally recited by realized saints. And then ultimately they were put down pen to paper. Okay? So I think it's significant that Swamiji, when necessary, was bold enough to break with tradition, modify tradition, revise tradition. And sometimes some people who read Swamiji try bending over backwards to prove that he is strictly in line, towing the traditional line. And I think that's a mistake. He doesn't always. And it's, there's a certain license of the Acharya to be bold enough to disagree with the past in certain respects. Of course, he greatly reveres tradition, accepts many, if not most aspects of it, but there are some things that he doesn't accept. There was a hereditary caste system which led to all sorts of abuse. Swami Vivekananda did not accept that. There's no way to argue that he did, even though some tried to. Okay. All right. So that's 1.7. And now finally, 1.8. The sutra reads, Viparyayaha. So this is error. Mithya jnanam atadrupa pratishtham. Bryant translates this as, error is false knowledge stemming from the incorrect apprehension of something. The favorite example, analogy used in Advaita Vedanta, all of you should be familiar with it. It involves a rope and a snake. Yeah, exactly. A rope and snake. There's actually a rope. I misperceive that rope as a snake. Very simple example of error here. Okay, false knowledge. So it's like literally the opposite of pramana taken as prama. Again, I don't want to get confusing, but because pramana in yoga philosophy is right knowledge. The second kind of vritti is viparyaya, which is false knowledge. I think I know a snake, but in fact, I don't know a snake at all. There is no snake there. And then I realize later, maybe by coming up really close to it, then I realize, oh, it's actually a rope. And then I get the right knowledge of the rope. And my false knowledge of the snake is removed. Where does it go? Good point. And it never existed. That's the idea. Okay, good. Yes. Okay, any questions? Do you have a question? Yeah, Sultan, do you have a mic for him? Yeah.
I guess my question kind of relates to the last shloka as well. Mm-hmm. But it's, so if we accept sense perception and verbal testimony, it doesn't seem like within those two claims, we have another mechanism that makes sure that the sense perception wasn't this mithya situation.
Right, that's good, yeah. But that's why it's important to, like, notice in Swami Vivekananda's commentary, for instance, he says, direct perception, pratyaksha, whatever we see and feel is proof if there has been nothing to delude the senses. So there's always this qualifying clause. And that's really important. Really? A lot of people think that they're perceiving things all the time. Huh? Oh, spiritual, yeah, but even like ordinary delusion too. I mean, people see things all the time which are not actually there, right? Either because they're high on some kind of drug or they're dreaming and they think that they're awake. There are all sorts of things that could be happening. So yeah, there's always that built-in clause. You shouldn't just... So the idea is, in the case of something like, if I'm perceiving what I think is a snake, right? And I think that I'm actually perceiving a snake. That means I'll say, yeah, I'm using the pramana of pratyaksha. I'm seeing that snake with my own eyes. In fact, it's a rope, let's say. What traditional Indian philosophers will say is that perception of the snake is not actually generated by the pramana of sense perception at all. It's a counterfeit pramana, but it's not a real pramana. You're not actually perceiving anything with the senses. So by definition, anything that's generated from a real pramana is going to be right knowledge. There's no possibility of error. But how do you explain misperceptions or error, cases of false knowledge, thinking that I see a snake, but when in fact it's a rope? It's not generated by a pramana. We can actually, some philosophers nowadays will they'll refer to it as a pseudo-pramana. P-S-E-U-D-O, pseudo-pramana. So we can distinguish pramana from pseudo. So false knowledge comes from pseudo-pramanas, whereas right knowledge comes from actual pramanas. Does that make sense? Well, the pseudo-pramana doesn't actually exist. I mean, that's why it's pseudo. It's not. It feels to me when I see a snake, and let's say I'm high or something, I'm just fully convinced that it's a snake that I'm seeing. So it has that kind of feeling of truth to it, right? But all along, it turns out that I'm not perceiving a snake with my senses, which means it's not a real pramana. Does that make sense? So it's pseudo. It turns out to be a fake pramana. Yeah? Okay. Other questions? Should I check online? Are there questions online, Narayana?
Apparently there's one question online.
Okay. Whoa, I just heard myself. Okay, well, I have it now so I can. Nancy, if I lived in the jungle, I would not know what a wall is. That's based on conditioning. The sutras say right knowledge is a vritti, and yoga is chitta vritti nirodha, the stopping of all fluctuations. Is there a question?
Doesn't look like a
Okay.
question.
I mean, I think she's like moving toward a question. If I lived in the jungle, I would not know what a wall is. That's based on conditioning. But I'm not sure. Can anyone come up with what the question would be?
Maybe he's saying yoga is stopping all fluctuations, but in that stop, you're actually stopping the fluctuation of right knowledge.
In that what? Stop?
Like, once you stop, and this like, maybe I'm trying to.
Maybe Nancy can help us herself. But anyway, yeah, go ahead.
I think,
In the meantime.
just like my interpretation is, so yoga is stopping all vrittis, but then right knowledge is a vritti.
Yeah.
So you're in like once
Why
you're
would you stop
reaching
right
yoga,
knowledge?
you're
That-
stopping right knowledge, and then this pratyaksha is right knowledge, and then you say you're perceiving the divine, but then in yoga you stop that as well.
Oh, I see. Well, that's a different. It's an interesting question, but I
Yeah.
don't think it is necessarily her question.
Oh.
But you just asked one, which is good. Yeah. So yes, the second sutra of the Yoga Sutra is yoga is defined as chitta vritti nirodha. You should stop all chitta vrittis, which means all 5 of these. Oh, where are the 5? Up here. Right? And that includes the supersensuous perception of Purusha, which is supposed to be the ultimate goal of yoga philosophy. So this is a good question. So when we stop right knowledge, what's left? And how do we attain the goal of life if we're stopping right knowledge, including the right knowledge of Purusha? Yeah, well, say that to the mic. Yeah, exactly.
Purusha is not a vritti. Vrittis come from the mind, and there's no mind in Purusha.
That's right, yeah, yeah. So the right knowledge of Purusha is a stepping stone toward just being Purusha. So even, there's a parallel here in Advaita Vedanta. Some of you might be familiar. There's Akhandakara Vritti. Akhandakara Vritti, it's a vritti, the same term is used, the same vritti as they use here, which means this, like a state of mind, of knowledge of what? Brahman, non-dual Brahman. Isn't that the goal? It's supposed to be. But what Advaita Vedanta say is, it's a stepping stone toward just being Brahman. So even that vritti will, in a sense, commit suicide, ultimately. So in the same way, the right knowledge of Purusha will commit suicide. The mind itself will dissolve, and then what's left is just Purusha. That's the idea. Okay? And there's another question online. Is Kundalini awakening a necessary or sufficient condition for self-realization, even though it may not happen formally through the yogic path? Yeah, it's an interesting question. Okay, there are a few things here. First of all, one thing to note about Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is that there is not a single mention of Kundalini anywhere in the text. Okay. However, interestingly, there's plenty of mention of Kundalini in Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga. And I talked about this in the first 5 classes of this class. We talked about his introduction, and I explained that his Raja Yoga is actually a kind of interesting, creative synthesis of different philosophical traditions. The major one is yoga philosophy of Patanjali, but he also combines it with Kundalini Yoga from which tradition? Tantra. Kundalini Yoga comes from Tantra. And Patanjali did not accept that. He may have believed in it, who knows, but he doesn't talk about it at all in the Yoga Sutra. Okay? And Swamiji brings in Vedantic ideas as well. So I see Raja Yoga as a kind of creative philosophical synthesis of yoga, Tantra, Kundalini Tantra, and Vedanta. So keeping that in mind, is Kundalini awakening a necessary, sufficient condition for self-realization, even though it may not happen formally through the yogic path? I think Patanjali's answer is no, just because there's absolutely nothing here about Kundalini at all. He's laid out exactly what's necessary and sufficient for realization. The Ashtanga Yoga, we'll get to that later. The 8-limbed yoga, Yama, Niyama, and so on and so forth. Those are the things that are essential. Now, will the Kundalini awaken by engaging in Patanjali's, the spiritual practices recommended by him? Maybe, or possibly. Sri Ramakrishna suggests that in the gospel. He says, you don't need to worry about like consciously trying to awaken the Kundalini. Because it could be dangerous if you prematurely awaken it before the mind is ready, before the mind is pure enough. But the Kundalini will automatically awaken through bhakti practices, by taking God's name, through prayer. By God's grace, the Kundalini will awaken. You don't need to like separately kind of... There are some practices where you're like directly trying to like strike at the, at the serpent's head so that the Kundalini awakens and it goes through the Sushumna and all that.
Raja Yoga, Vivekananda describes how to awaken Kundalini with certain practices.
Yeah, sometimes. But he also warns against doing these things without the guidance of a guru, and without practicing strict celibacy, and like there are all these kind of like, disclaimers that he adds as well. Pranayama, he recommends pranayama, and then he says, but don't practice it on your own without a guru, and unless you're practicing strict brahmacharya, strict celibacy, for instance. Yeah. Okay, other questions? Oh, Nancy actually followed up on herself. So, okay, she says, direct perception is from conditioning, and perception is a vritti. We are trying to get rid of all thought. She's not fond of the question form, so she's giving another she's giving another sentence. Okay. Okay. So let's since we have a little time, I thought there would be more like questions here, but let's look at some more aspects of Bryant's commentary on 1.7. Let me read to you I said that I like skipped over, so let me read to you this whole paragraph. This is bottom of page 33, going into 34. Vachaspati Mishra raises a question here. If the impression is imprinted on the mind, which according to the metaphysics of yoga is a totally separate entity from the Purusha soul, then how is it that the latter is aware of it? The latter is the Purusha. Okay. Or, as he puts it, if an axe cuts a Kadira tree, it is not a Plaksha tree that is thereby cut. It's a very simple analogy to follow. But then Bryant thankfully explains what that analogy means. In other words, this is Bryant speaking now, explaining Vachaspati's worry. If an impression is something that is made on the mind, then how does it end up being made on the Purusha? Which is what Vyasa seems to be saying. That it's Purusha who makes the misidentification with the Chitta Vṛttis. Now Bryant gives this somewhat complicated explanation. Here again, Vachaspati Mishra introduces the analogy of a mirror. It is the mind and intelligence, not the soul, that take the form of the object as a result of sense perception. Notice this sentence. It is the mind, the manas and the buddhi on the side of prakriti, not the soul meaning Purusha, that take the form of the object as a result of sense perception. According to the reflection model of awareness, consciousness is reflected in the intelligence, the buddhi, due to their proximity, and then is misidentified with the reflection by the mind. It's the mind that's doing the misidentification. It's the sentence is written in the passive voice, so it gets a little confusing. But see, consciousness is reflected in the buddhi due to their proximity. The proximity of what? Purusha with the buddhi. And then that Purusha is misidentified with the reflection by the mind, by the buddhi.
That makes sense.
Okay. This reflection in turn is altered according to the form assumed by the intelligence, just as a reflection appears dirty if the mirror is dirty. Thus, since the mind and intelligence have taken the form of the object in question, consciousness sees its own reflection as containing that form. Here, though, I have to pause here because I trip over these kinds of expressions. Consciousness sees its own reflection as containing that form. What is consciousness? It has to be the consciousness of Purusha, I think.
What's the issue?
The issue is that Purusha can't be doing the misidentifying. It can't be making any mistakes.
I don't think it's making a mistake.
It's saying consciousness sees its own reflection as containing the form of the Chitta Vṛttis. That's the mistake. It's falsely identifying with the Chitta Vṛttis, right? You don't see that as a problem? Yeah. Oh, can we give the mic to Katyayani? Thank you.
Okay, maybe completely off topic, but I heard somewhere once in a different text that that true reality is beyond consciousness and unconsciousness. And that's really confusing because different texts are like, it is consciousness, bliss, and everything, but that true reality is beyond
But
consciousness.
who says that? I mean, everything depends on who says that.
It was a Buddhist philosophy, and so that's why I didn't want to like bring it up here, but
Yeah.
that's just your question reminded me of that, is like Purusha beyond consciousness, or is it saying that it is
No,
consciousness?
Purusha is. It's
It
pure
is
consciousness. Yeah, Purusha is defined as pure consciousness.
Okay.
Eternal, pure consciousness. Yeah. So let me finish the paragraph. Or maybe before I do, let me just, speaking of that, I mean, that we have to be very careful about what paradigm we're bringing in. And so, yeah, Buddhism, they believe in this no-self doctrine, right? So they don't really believe in an eternally pure consciousness.
That's the only thing I could think of, though, like what you said, because that's confusing. I understand you were like, where you're tripping.
Well, so as I said, I mean, my take as a Vedantin, when I read this text, I think it's an invaluable text. And I think the thing that's missing is a jiva. I think we need a jiva, a real jiva, who is bound and liberated. That's my suggestion. And there's no place for a jiva in the Sankhyan metaphysical scheme, unfortunately, as far as I can tell. The jiva doesn't fall inside of... It's conscious in the way that Purusha is conscious, and yet it's actually bound. It makes mistakes. It gets bound to this world. It reincarnates again and again, takes new bodies. And so, so as a Vedanta, what I do is, there's a tremendous amount to learn from this text. But what I do is I bring in this concept of a jiva, which I think is missing from Patanjali's philosophy. That's my solution. But I'm avoiding lazy harmonizing because I'm not claiming that Patanjali is positing a jiva. Do you see? So I'm not reading the jiva into the text, but I'm supplementing this text with the Vedantic jiva as a way of making sense of it. Yeah, first you, can you bring the mic to her? Can you give her the mic? Could you just wait for the mic, please? Thanks. Yeah.
Ramakrishna, Buddha, Christ, they did not come here to work out karma. They came here and said, I'm going to help my brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
I know that this earth is going to be experience of pain and all that, and they don't suffer what they suffer as karma. It's
Right. And
to
they don't
show,
clear out of their
to
karma,
show us
Yeah.
how to do it.
Yeah, that's
Thank
right.
you,
Yeah. No, that's right.
Swami.
Yeah. We're on the same page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
and that's why they
Yeah.
incarnate, and like you said, they suffer and they eat junk food and gain weight and have physical or all kinds of problems. It's not their karma. That's how it is here.
Yeah, it's their play, the divine play. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Is that did that sound good?
It all sounds plausible to me. Yeah.
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 Well,
Yes.
I had a question. I'm wondering how Purusha interacts with Buddhi. I mean,
It doesn't. It's not supposed to.
yeah, so...
But then
how-
you see words like proximity.
You just read how it interacts.
I know. That's why I'm saying. That's part of the reason why I think that there are philosophical problems. There should not be any interaction.
But it clearly interacts. It's just...
Well, no, they're using language of interaction to explain something that's, I think, is ultimately inexplicable. I think they're going to have to ultimately throw up their hands and say, like, stop asking us that question, that pesky question. It's like Advaita Vedantins hate the question of where does Maya come from? Where does the world, even if this world is an illusion, where does it come from? Why do I even see an illusory world? They hate that question. And so even asking the question is wrong. That's why they turn the tables and don't ask the question. Yes, Leela.
I was just thinking that I think it's back in 1.3 when they're describing of the use of the pramana to actually deliver information of what is being experienced in the outside world back to Buddhi. That's where the actual reflection confusion, I think, starts to come. Is that Well, I just saying that coming back to the idea of a jiva, but the actual individual purusha that ends up.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you're positing some kind of individual purusha, but that is a kind of jiva. But as I said, purusha can't make mistakes according to Sankhya philosophy. The jiva can, but there is no jiva in this philosophy. But again, I should add this too. There are some Sankhya commentators, modern, like Hariharananda Āraṇya is a notable example of one.
Yeah.
This is a translation of his commentary, which he originally wrote in Bengali. And he says, who is bound and liberated? The jiva. But I actually think that he's going out on a limb here and positing an entity that doesn't quite fit easily in the metaphysical scheme. But he also has a very interesting twist on the whole thing, as far as I can tell. He can be interpreted in different ways, but I think what he's ultimately saying is, he might even tell me, yeah, you're right, there is no place for a jiva in Sankhya metaphysics. And when the jiva attains liberation, the jiva's liberation consists in realizing that it never existed. The jiva is a kind of phantom entity that he invents, that we invent for the purposes of explaining who's doing spiritual practices, who is bound, who ultimately gets liberated. And liberation consists in realizing that it never happened, actually. It gets kind of weird. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, Sultan has a question.
I guess, does yoga philosophy accept Maya at all?
They don't
Like
use the
sort of
term Maya anywhere. And what do you mean by Maya? Let's wait. What?
Oh boy.
Different people mean different things by it.
I guess, I mean, like, so I guess, like, let's say if you have a sense perception, but it's not, like, it might be, it might be like a spectrum of correctness, I guess. Like, it's hard for me to think of a good example, but like, you see something and like, you see an aspect of it that is true, but it's not the essence of what you saw.
So it's partly true and partly false, is that what you mean?
Exactly.
Some part of it
So,
could be true.
so the partly false version is Maya, I guess, in a sense.
So like illusion.
Like,
But
it's
then
like
it becomes
diluted.
like that second, what's that? This viparya. Is that just false knowledge? Is that what you mean?
I guess.
I mean, so Maya in Advaita Vedanta has a very specific meaning. It
Yeah.
typically means illusion, right? And but Sankhya and Yoga accept this world as real, as fully real. So there's a key difference there. If what you mean by Maya is illusion, okay? Yeah, we have to wrap it up, so please be succinct. Yeah.
Just what the love, the service and the love, and that I'm kind of out. I'm talking to a lot of people, and the biggest thing is the family feud thing of. What am I going to do with this family member? Should I just shoot it right? You know what?
You don't shoot it.
Yeah, I know. But then I go, and then I actually, just the other day, somebody said that. Said that to me, like, and I said, you have to spend time, finding out what you like, what they like, and be patient and loving and serving
we'll
and
continue
giving.
This after class. How about
right?
that? Because
Okay,
it's not directly relevant. Thank
that's
you. Yeah.
what it was all about.
Yeah, thank you. All right, thanks, guys. June 6th, Thursday is our next class. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Rama Krishna Arpanamastu.